Some successes arrive too early. They look impressive. They draw attention. They create momentum. And yet, history shows that the outcomes we admire most are rarely the ones that appeared first. In long-term studies of performance, careers, and institutions, one pattern keeps resurfacing. Speed is often mistaken for strength. Early wins feel decisive, but they frequently collapse under their own weight. The structure beneath them was never given time to form. Power, in its most durable form, does not announce itself. It does not rush. It does not demand recognition. It waits. Patience is usually described as passive, something quiet, something gentle. But when patience is absent, the consequences are not neutral. They are measurable. Accelerated decisions lead to fragile systems. Rapid growth exposes weaknesses before they can be corrected. Momentum replaces judgment. Some people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they moved too fast. What makes this difficult to see is that impatience is often rewarded at first. Applause comes early. Progress appears obvious. Meanwhile, the slower path, less visible, less celebrated, continues without proof, without reassurance. And by the time the difference becomes clear, it is usually irreversible. This is a story about patience, not as waiting, but as restraint. Not as delay, but as control. And why the most powerful outcomes often begin where attention fades. What made the situation difficult to identify was how ordinary it was. There was an established relationship built on consistency, shared goals, and time. A partnership that functioned the way it was supposed to. Conversations flowed. Decisions were mutual. Trust existed without effort. From the outside, and even from within, there was nothing to flag as unstable. Nothing felt wrong. There were no arguments to point to. No raised voices. No moments dramatic enough to remember later as warnings. Daily routines continued uninterrupted. Plans were made and followed. Progress appeared steady. If anything, the bond seemed efficient, calm, productive, reliable. The kind of dynamic people describe as healthy simply because it never demands attention. And yet, subtle changes began to register, not as events, but as sensations. Pauses where responses used to come quickly. Agreements that felt slightly revised when repeated. Decisions that appeared shared, but carried an unfamiliar weight afterward. They were too small to challenge, too minor to confront, each one easy to dismiss in isolation. The mind found explanations: fatigue, stress, overthinking. But the body reacted differently. Tension appeared without a clear cause. Focus slipped at unexpected moments. A low-grade alertness settled in, persistent but undefined, like noticing a sound you couldn't locate. There was still no conflict. Still no evidence. Still no reason to be concerned. Which raised a question that refused to go away. If nothing was wrong, why did my body react before my mind did? The answer would not arrive quickly. It never does. And that delay, quiet, rational, easy to ignore, would become the most important part of the story. This is not a story meant to inspire in the usual way. There are no shortcuts hidden here. No dramatic reversals designed to reassure. What follows is an examination, careful, deliberate, of how patience changes outcomes long before results appear, of how growth often develops without visibility, without praise, and without confirmation, and of why success, when pursued too quickly, has a way of undoing the very people chasing it. The events you're about to hear are not rare. They repeat across careers, partnerships, and institutions. The pattern is consistent enough to study, even if it's rarely discussed. When impatience accelerates progress, it also exposes weaknesses that time was meant to correct. This story unfolds as a record of decisions, what was said, what was delayed, and what was resisted. It is structured less like motivation and more like observation, a lesson presented through tension rather than reassurance. Consider it a case study in human behavior, not a metaphor, not speculation, a sequence of moments where restraint carried consequences and timing proved more influential than effort. By the end, you won't see patience as waiting. You'll see it as control. And once that distinction becomes clear, it's difficult to unsee, because it changes how success itself is measured. 2:30, 4:30, the setup, the story begins. The person at the center of this story was not remarkable in any obvious way. There was no early advantage, no dramatic talent that drew attention, just discipline, quiet, consistent, and rarely noticed. While others spoke confidently about their plans, this individual focused on repetition, learning systems instead of outcomes, asking questions that slowed conversations but clarified decisions. Progress showed up in small ways. Skills accumulated steadily. Tasks were completed with precision. Errors decreased over time. The work improved, but without spectacle. There were no moments that invited applause, only incremental refinement that required patience to recognize. They learned faster than most, not because they rushed, but because they paused long enough to understand structure. They worked longer hours, not out of urgency, but to reduce uncertainty. Each additional effort was meant to remove weak points before they could become visible. And yet, visibility went elsewhere. Peers advanced more quickly. Recognition followed those who spoke first, moved faster, and accepted early risk. External validation clustered around momentum, not preparation. Promotions, opportunities, and attention seemed to reward decisiveness over depth. Pressure began to build, not from failure, but from comparison. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Others were succeeding sooner. Their progress was measurable, public, and reinforced. Meanwhile, the slower path offered no confirmation that it was correct. That was when the internal question surfaced, not as doubt, but as calculation. Am I being patient or afraid? There was no answer yet. Only the sense that timing mattered, and choosing wrong would not reveal itself immediately. So the work continued, quietly, without payoff. For now, the first opportunity arrived without ceremony. It wasn't framed as a shortcut. It was described as efficiency, a chance to accelerate progress by adopting a method already proven to work, at least on the surface. The language was familiar: faster results, clearer metrics, immediate recognition. A system designed to reward momentum. Others accepted without hesitation. They adjusted their approach, reduced steps, simplified processes that had once required care. In a short time, the results were visible. Numbers increased, titles changed, public markers of success began to appear. For the first time, the contrast was no longer theoretical. The offer sat there, reasonable and available. Declining it required explanation. Accepting it required only compliance. The pressure was subtle but persistent, reinforced by examples that seemed to confirm the choice was safe. The hesitation wasn't moral, it was structural. Adopting the shortcut would have required abandoning certain safeguards, steps that slowed progress but prevented error. It would have meant trusting outcomes before fully understanding the system producing them. So the decision was made quietly. Patience was chosen. The cost was immediate. Opportunities narrowed. Visibility decreased. Questions began to surface about commitment and ambition. The absence of rapid results was interpreted as reluctance rather than restraint. Meanwhile, peers who had moved quickly continued to advance. Their progress was discussed openly. Their success became reference points. Invitations followed them. Confidence grew, not just in others, but around them. Doubt settled in. Envy followed, not as resentment, but as calculation. The mind began to measure what was being sacrificed: time, recognition, relevance. And for the first time, patience felt less like control and more like risk. The audience recognizes this moment because it's familiar. This is where most decisions are made. Not when the consequences are clear, but when the reward is close enough to touch. And once passed, the outcome cannot be revised. The shift did not happen all at once. At first, the successes that came quickly began to show signs of strain, not publicly, but in patterns that were easy to overlook. Extended hours turned into exhaustion. Confidence hardened into defensiveness. Small errors appeared, then multiplied, each one managed just well enough to avoid attention. Burnout did not announce itself. It revealed itself through inconsistency. Foundations that had been assembled rapidly required constant reinforcement. Processes needed repeated correction. What looked stable from a distance depended heavily on continuous effort to maintain the appearance of progress. Along the way, quiet compromises were made. Standards were adjusted. Short-term solutions replaced long-term planning. Decisions were justified by urgency rather than accuracy. None of this was framed as failure. It was framed as adaptation. Meanwhile, the slower path continued unchanged. No sudden advances, no visible rewards, just accumulation, skills refined, systems reinforced, errors eliminated before they could scale. Growth occurred without markers, progress without witnesses. That was when another pattern became visible. Certain decisions began to receive delayed responses, not rejection, not approval, simply time. Requests sat unanswered longer. Evaluations arrived without explanation. Feedback became minimal but precise. It suggested observation, not judgment. Tracking. Timing appeared to matter more than output, consistency more than speed. Decisions were not rewarded immediately, but they were recorded. This was not a test of motivation. It was a process of selection. Those who rushed forward were not being encouraged, they were being revealed. Their choices exposed limits faster than time alone could. The pace acted as a filter, separating momentum from endurance. And patience, once mistaken for hesitation, began to look like alignment. The story was no longer about effort or ambition. It was about who could remain intact long enough to matter. Time began to narrow options. Opportunities that once felt possible started to close, not abruptly, but through expiration. Deadlines passed without renewal. Invitations stopped arriving. What remained required more effort for less return. Resources thinned. Support became conditional. Access was reduced. Each decision now carried more weight because there were fewer chances to absorb mistakes. The margin for error disappeared quietly, without announcement. Confidence followed the same pattern. It didn't collapse. It eroded. Certainty was replaced by calculation. Progress was measured less by improvement and more by survival. The absence of feedback created a vacuum where doubt could settle. Without external signals, even well-reasoned choices felt provisional. Patience, once framed as control, now felt indistinguishable from delay. Isolation set in, not physical but directional. The path forward no longer intersected with others. Comparisons became unavoidable. Those who had moved faster appeared established. Their positions, once fragile, now looked fixed. Silence dominated this period. No confirmation. No correction. No reassurance. Just continued effort without visible effect. That was when the question surfaced fully, not as strategy, but as tension. If patience is powerful, why does it hurt? There was no answer, only the realization that restraint extracts its cost up front, while its value, if it exists at all, remains deferred. This was the moment most people reverse course. Not because they lack discipline, but because waiting without evidence demands more control than action ever does. And in that stillness, with everything reduced to uncertainty, the story reached its lowest point. Clarity did not arrive as an announcement. It arrived as alignment. The first sign was timing. Decisions that had been deferred for months were addressed without negotiation. Evaluations appeared fully formed, referencing patterns rather than outcomes. Details were acknowledged that had never been discussed openly. It became evident that progress had not been ignored. It had been observed. Behind the visible system, where speed, output, and recognition dominated, another layer operated quietly. Long-term evaluators monitored consistency under pressure, not isolated performance, but behavior over extended intervals, not moments of success, but responses to prolonged uncertainty. Access was structured through delayed gates. Advancement required passing periods where nothing happened, where motivation could not rely on reinforcement, where choices were made without reward. These intervals functioned as trials, not of ability, but of control. Impatience did not disqualify immediately. It revealed itself over time. What was measured was growth in its least visible form. Emotional regulation when progress stalled. Strategic endurance when outcomes were unclear. Psychological dominance over impulse, comparison, and urgency. Speed had never been the metric. Growth was. And growth required space. It required resistance. It required the capacity to remain intact while others fragmented under acceleration. In that reframing, patience stopped resembling delay. It emerged as discipline under observation, a form of power that operates without force, without noise, and without the need to be seen. The story shifted here, not toward inspiration, but understanding. Because once growth is recognized as the real measure, the earlier losses no longer appear accidental. They appear necessary. 12:00:13:30, the final turn, success, arrives differently. When success arrived, it did so quietly. There were no celebrations, no sudden elevation, no accolades that marked the moment, yet its impact was undeniable. Decisions that had once seemed inconsequential now held weight. Opportunities opened that required understanding, restraint, and perspective, the very qualities patience had honed. It was durable. Not flashy or public, but resilient. Resistant to shortcuts, to pressure, to external forces. What had been built steadily over time could endure scrutiny, adaptation, and the inevitable challenges of a world that rewards haste. Those who had rushed forward continued along paths they could no longer sustain. They were ahead in visibility, but lacked the foundations to last. Their early momentum could not bridge the gap between speed and stability. The system revealed its preference, not for those who acted quickly, but for those who acted wisely. Patience, once interpreted as delay or indecision, was finally understood for what it had always been. Power over time. Resilience in silence. Control without urgency. It was a success that could not have existed without restraint. And in that realization, the story turned. Patience was no longer a choice to delay. It was the mechanism by which enduring achievement is built. The story concludes not with applause, but with understanding. Patience is not waiting. It is not a passive pause in life. It is the deliberate act of resisting premature identity, the urge to define success before the foundation is ready. When patience is exercised thoughtfully, it allows growth to unfold naturally. Skills deepen, decisions gain clarity, systems strengthen. This growth creates stability, a structure capable of supporting real achievement rather than fleeting recognition. Stability, in turn, produces success that lasts. Not the immediate triumphs that draw attention, but the kind that persists, that endures scrutiny, that cannot be dismantled by haste. The lessons are simple but profound. Those who rush often advance visibly, but those who remain measured, disciplined, and patient accumulate invisible power. They survive trials, endure uncertainty, and eventually occupy positions that appear effortless, but are earned through restraint. As we return to the opening thought, some people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they moved too fast. Patience is the quiet force that separates temporary wins from lasting power. It is the measure that time itself respects. Most people give up just before patience becomes power. They abandon effort when the outcome is still invisible, never realizing that what they thought was delay was actually preparation. What they dismissed as hesitation was actually the moment that determines lasting success. How many times have you mistaken impatience for ambition? How often have you rushed, only to see opportunities slip beyond your control? Take a moment to reflect. The answer isn't simple, and it isn't immediate. If you want to explore more stories that reveal hidden patterns, unseen decisions, and the quiet forces behind real success, subscribe to Twist Tale. Every story here uncovers what most people overlook and shows why restraint can be the most powerful tool of all. The moment is over, but the question remains. Will you recognize the value of patience before it's too late?